Hello there, my name is Funshaw. I'm a 3D character artist, and here's my workflow for making my realistic 3D characters. I'll be creating this portrait you see here called Tola and Khalseed. I didn't have an initial direction with this portrait at the start, but down the line I chose to add this to the world of a character I created recently. This is a 3-part series where I cover each individual process over several videos, and then do a breakdown of the tiger since that was more of an afterthought. This first video is going to be focusing on the sculpting. Let's get started. So, the first thing you want to do when you want to start a project is gather reference. Sometimes I might sketch it out, or other times I might just go through sites such as Pinterest or ArtStation and get inspiration from there. Then I build like an image in my head of what I want, or like I said, I sketch it out. But this time I just basically eyeballed it. When looking through the reference, I knew I wanted big cornrow braids, and then I started gathering images that fit that description and put them on the board in a referencing tool called PureRef. I then moved this tool to another screen and launched Zbrush. So the first part of the recording got overwritten, so I've sculpted the head, a random head, to highlight my workflow up to where I can continue with the original sculpt. Starting with a simple sphere is a good practice exercise, but really I find it mundane and repetitive to start that process for every single character I sculpt. Instead, I start with a base mesh, which could be anything from the simple head plane models that come with Zbrush or a previously used base model. Here I saved one of my previous sculpts as a default base mesh. This was from a past project called Ginger Trina, I believe. And with this, I don't have to worry about like positioning of the eyes, the distance between like the nose and the ridge and all these like little technical things, because I already have them in the base mesh. I will change them around, but it's a good starting points to have at this point. So I set my focal length to around 60 because most portraits have 60 and upwards focal lengths, at least most like professional photography. I don't know, it just looks good, and from a photography background it's more ideal to sculpt that way. So the base mesh is already dynameshed, and what I'm going to do is erase the mouth, eyes and nose so that I have a clean plate to start off of. This would help to make the character different from the previous character. That's what I think, in my opinion anyway. So here I'm exposing the eye and the chronicle and looking at reference at the same time. For about 80 to 90% of the sculpts, I use the clay build-up brush, and I totally ignored the smooth brush. So it looks rough, but it's intentionally rough. It's kind of like the beginning of a real clay sculpt. For the nose, I use the Demian standard brush to carve the nostrils up onto the side of the nose, and then go into the clay build-up brush to refine it. I also like to use a hatching kind of hand motion on my tablet, because it helps me define planes and make transition between those planes. I never fully finish one part of the sculpt before going on to the next. I usually sculpt like a bit of the eyes and a bit of the nose and the mouth and so on and so forth until the whole face looks good basically. For the mouth, I start by defining the corners using the center of the eyes as reference, and I use the Damian standard brush to create a line in between those points. Then I use the lasso mask to mask the lower lip and then drag the upper lip upwards with the brush, and then invert the mask and do the same for the lower lip. After this is done, I dynamesh and use the clay build-up brush to finish the sculpting of the lips. After I create all the major features, I then go in more detail, adding and removing digital clay. I always use reference because you think you know what it looks like, but no, you really don't. I usually like to keep the mouth slightly open so it's easier to sculpt and retopologize in the future. Now you wouldn't believe me, but an important part of the eyes are the eyelids. I usually etch this in with the Demian standard and then mask around the eye and pull the sculpt down to create the eyelid fold. I use this technique again after the sculpt has been retopologized and it gets me a good result. Now we've caught up with our original sculpt, I'm going to switch back to it and start off with the retopologizing process. Using a downloaded V-Face pack from the Texturing XYZ website, I'm loading the head mesh from that pack. It's a really good resource to have as it gets you good UVs, you don't have to project the textures, and it has great retopology. I moved the subtool into place so it somewhat matches the size of the sculpt, and then I load up the Z-Wrap plugin. Here I can wrap the V-Face model onto the sculpt I've made. After the wrapping process has been completed, I subdivide the mesh 3 times and then continue sculpting. Notice I don't use the smooth brush, I just change the focal shift of the clay builder brush to 0 and then turn off the alpha. Then I continue with my hatching method of adding and removing geometry. I use the smooth brush sparingly, maybe a few times to smooth up some surfaces, but the smooth brush tends to destroy a lot of detail, so I try to avoid using it as much as possible. Then I focus on getting plane changes and transitions from my reference. I always aim to not make a perfectly smooth face, but rather a lot of secondary details on the skin, maybe like bone definitions, muscles, fat deposits, all that. Essentially sculpt over the whole face with the clay build-up hatching method, and then I use the Damian standard brush for wrinkles and indents. Sometimes I might carve really deep with the Damian standard brush and then go over it with the clay build-up brush to create maybe like a wrinkle on the side of the nose or whatnot. From this point on, I just keep moving things around and adding features from my reference until I feel good about the sculpt. It's also good practice to leave the sculpt, go outside, touch grass, clear your head, and then come back to it with some fresh eyes so that you can see that the eyes are terrible. After some time with the sculpt, I add in a sphere for some very basic looking hair, sculpting some cornrows, some eyebrows, so I can visualize it before the end. I also use the poly paint to paint in the eyes, some eyelashes, some cheek and lip coloration, make it kind of like a black and white drawing so I can have a little proof of concept. At this point, I like the look of the sculpt and I'm going to move on to the high frequency detail. I start by subdividing my geometry to subdivision level 7. This gives me 53 million polygons to work with. That's quite high, but not as much as it takes to render a 3D portrait of your mom. It also gives my PC mini strokes, so it's a good idea to save every now and then. I then create 5 layers in the layer panel. The first one is noise, where I add some subtle noise to the surface of the sculpt. After which I create a morph target so that the subsequent layers can be easily manipulated. The next 3 layers are the primary, secondary, and tertiary layers. To apply these layers, I set up a blank 8K texture in the UV map panel, and then I add the RGB separated channels from my Texturing XYZ map. After importing these maps into Zbrush, I flip them and make them into alphas, and then apply them as the displacements in the primary and secondary and tertiary layers respectively. I usually keep an intensity of about 0.02 for the maps and then tweak their influence later in the layer slider. The last layer is the correction layer. This is where I fix artifacts from the projection and then add wrinkles, bumps, lip details, and other corrections that I find along the way. At this point, I also like to break symmetry and then start moving things around so that I don't have a weird or natural, perfectly symmetrical robot face. If for whatever reason you want to sculpt something along the skin surface without destroying the details that are already present here, you can use the standard brush and it works really well. After all my detailing is done and Zbrush has crashed a few times, I use the normal map panel to bake a normal map, flip it and then export it. I export the mesh at subdivision level 2 for the low poly and subdivision level 6 for the high poly. If you have the NASA computer to export it at level 7, then for sure go for it. If you don't, however, then I suggest exporting it at level 6 like I have here. That way you can bake the ambient occlusion and curvature maps in Substance Painter. We already have the crisp 8K normal map from the Zbrush bake, and that can be used in the texturing process. If you want to see the part 2 of this video, or you want to check out some of my other videos on this channel, then don't hesitate to like and subscribe. I never thought I'd be saying that.